So what if ancient mystics weren't describing a symbol, but a state of consciousness? Because for thousands of years, prophets, rabbis, Kabbalists, Hermetic philosophers, Egyptian priests, and modern spiritual seekers, they have all described something that is remarkably similar. A vehicle of light, a divine throne, a geometric field surrounding the human body, a pathway between heaven and earth. Different names, different cultures, yet somehow this same idea keeps appearing. Coincidence? Or were they attempting to describe an experience that is extremely difficult to put into words? Now, to understand the Merkabah, we have to go back thousands of years to one of the strangest passages in the entire Bible. And honestly, if you've never read this for yourself, it's pretty weird. Now, the story comes from the book of Ezekiel. Now, Ezekiel was a Hebrew prophet. One day, he had a vision. Not a dream, a vision. And what he describes sounds almost impossible to picture. He is describing that he sees what appears to be a storm approaching. A great cloud, flashing fire, brilliant light. And then, things become even stranger. He describes 4 living creatures, each with multiple faces, each moving with perfect coordination. And beside them, he sees what he calls wheels. Wheels within wheels. Intersecting wheels. That are moving in ways that don't seem bound by normal direction. And then he says something that fascinates mystics for thousands of years. The wheels were covered with eyes. Eyes everywhere. Imagine hearing that for the first time. Wheels within wheels. Eyes covering every surface. Living creatures moving in perfect harmony. And above all of it, there's a throne. The throne of God. Now here's where things get interesting. Because most people read this passage and the first thing that they ask is, what was Ezekiel seeing? But ancient Jewish mystics asked a different question. They asked, what was Ezekiel experiencing? Because they believed that this vision wasn't simply describing something in the sky. It was describing an encounter with the divine, a journey into higher consciousness, a glimpse beyond ordinary reality. And over time, those mystics, they became obsessed with this vision. They studied it, they meditated on it, they built entire mystical traditions around it. And eventually, they gave a name to the divine chariot described by Ezekiel, Merkabah, which literally means chariot. This is why the Merkabah isn't just a geometric symbol, and it isn't some modern New Age invention. Its roots go all the way back to one of the most mysterious visions in Scripture. A vision so strange that people are still debating what it means more than 2,000 years later. But what if the wheels, the eyes, the living creatures, and the throne were never meant to be taken literally? What if they were symbols? This is a language that is used to describe something that words struggle to capture. Because once we start following that thread, the mystery only gets deeper. Now, here's where the mystery starts expanding beyond the Bible. Because eventually people began noticing something fascinating. The same patterns keep appearing. Not just in religious texts, not just in mystical visions, but in nature itself, in architecture, in temples, in ancient art, in sacred symbols from cultures separated by oceans and centuries. And one of those patterns appears in what most people now associate with the Merkabah. 2 interlocking geometric forms. One pointing inward, one pointing downward. Almost like heaven and earth meeting in the same place. And what's fascinating is that ancient traditions didn't use geometry as a language. Not because they worship shapes, but because shapes could communicate ideas that words struggle to explain. Words like balance, harmony, order, the relationship between the visible and the invisible. This is where the famous Hermetic phrase comes from. As above, so below. A simple statement, but one that has echoed through thousands of years of mystical thought. The idea that what exists within us somehow reflects what exists beyond us. That the microcosm reflects the macrocosm. The individual reflects the universe. And suddenly, the Merkabah begins looking less like an object and more like a symbol of connection, a symbol of alignment, a symbol of something ancient people believed linked heaven and earth together. And that's where the mystery gets even stranger. Because remember those strange creatures Ezekiel described? The lion, the bull, the eagle, the human. Most people never think about them again. But ancient scholars absolutely did. And over time, many traditions began associating those same symbols with something else. The zodiac, specifically the 4 fixed signs: Leo, Taurus, Scorpio, and Aquarius. Now think about that for a second. The same 4 symbols keep appearing in the Bible, in astrology, in mystical traditions, in ancient artwork, in sacred architecture, again and again and again. At some point, you start asking why. Why these symbols? Why not others? Some believe that they represented stability, the pillars of creation, the guardians of cosmic order. And others believe that they represented aspects of human consciousness itself. Different interpretation, same symbols. And this is where I think that people often miss something important. Ancient people weren't necessarily trying to give us information. They were trying to give us understanding. They spoke through symbols because symbols have a way of bypassing the intellect and speaking directly to something deeper. And that's exactly why the images continue to survive thousands of years later. And then we find another strange coincidence: the chariot. Most people know the chariot as a tarot card. And if you've ever looked at its meaning, you'll probably see things like determination, willpower, success, forward movement. And that's true. Because I think the deeper symbolism is even more interesting. Because a chariot is not powerful because it exists. A chariot is powerful because it is directed. Something is guiding it. Something is holding opposing forces together. Something is choosing the destination. And suddenly the symbolism is sounding familiar. A divine chariot, a vehicle of consciousness, a path between worlds. What if the ancient question wasn't, how do I accept this world? But how do I become a master of myself? Because every spiritual tradition eventually arrives at the same challenge. Can you direct your thoughts, your emotions, your impulses, your attention? Or are they directing you? Maybe that's the real chariot. Maybe that's the real journey. This is where Kabbalah enters the story. And honestly, Kabbalah is an entire universe by itself. But for our purpose, there's one idea that matters: transformation. People assume that spiritual traditions are about collecting beliefs. But many of these mystics, they believe something very different. They believe that spirituality was about becoming, not believing, becoming. Becoming more conscious, more aware, more integrated, more aligned. The famous tree of life became a symbolic map of that journey, a movement of fragmentation toward wholeness, from unconsciousness toward awareness, and from separation toward connection. And when you look at it that way, the Merkabah begins looking less like transportation and more like transformation. Not a vehicle that carries you somewhere else, a process that changes who you are. And this is where things become surprisingly modern. Because long before neuroscience, long before psychology, long before we had the language that we use today, human beings were trying to map out consciousness. Now, Carl Jung believed symbols emerged from something deeper than culture, something he called the collective unconscious, a collection of archetypes shared by humanity itself. And when you look at visions like Ezekiel's or symbols like the Merkabah, you begin wondering, are these descriptions of outer realities or inner realities? What if the throne, the ascent, the chariot, the divine encounter are all symbols for something that's happening within the human psyche? The integration of mind, body, spirit. The movement from chaos toward wholeness. Because maybe enlightenment, awakening, individuation, and spiritual transformation are all pointing toward the same destination using different words. And this is the question that I keep coming back to. Why do these ideas keep appearing? Different continents, different languages, different religions, different centuries, yet somehow the same themes survive. A journey upward, a divine encounter, transformation, alignment, expansion of consciousness. Some called it enlightenment. Some called it gnosis. Some called it union with God. Some called it Christ consciousness. Some called it the Merkabah. Different symbols, different stories, different names. But they were all describing the same experience. An experience so profound that ordinary language couldn't fully contain it. And that's why symbols remain. Maybe the Merkabah was never a machine. Maybe it was never a spaceship. Maybe it was never meant to be taken literal at all. Maybe this was humanity's attempt to describe what happens when a person becomes aligned. When body, mind, and spirit begin moving in the same direction. When awareness expands beyond survival. When the individual begins experiencing something that is greater than themselves. Because the real mystery isn't whether the Merkabah exists. The mystery is why civilizations separated by thousands of years kept pointing to the same idea. Because the symbol was never the destination. The transformation was.